In the spring of 1945, as Hitler's regime disintegrated across a ruined Europe, the fighting in the Pacific had not yet reached its most savage phase. American forces had driven the Japanese back from island after island, until only the Ryukyus and the Japanese home islands remained of the once extensive Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. For the sailors and soldiers aboard a Bayfield-class attack transport, though, the greatest trial of their stamina and bravery was just beginning. The strategic logic was grim and straightforward. Okinawa had to be secured before a final invasion of Japan could be attempted, and taking that small ring of coral and volcanic ground would exact an appalling toll. 36 ships were sunk. Almost 10,000 sailors were killed or wounded, and the land forces paid an even heavier price. The Army recorded about 4,600 dead and 19,000 wounded, while the Marines, who shouldered the fiercest fighting ashore, suffered nearly 19,000 casualties. Those figures forced a dreadful question. If the defenders resisted so fanatically at Okinawa, what horrors would await an invasion force at the beaches of the home islands? Operation Iceberg, the name given to the Okinawa campaign, had been planned in the autumn of 1944. At roughly the same time the transport was entering service. The Joint Chiefs had wrangled over strategy. Should they bypass the Philippines, push through China, or seize Formosa? And ultimately adopted a multi-axis plan. Landings in the Philippines, followed by operations to take nearby islands, and then Okinawa. On April 1, 1945, while fighting still raged in the Philippines, and after the costly victory at Iwo Jima, American troops went ashore on Okinawa. It was Easter Sunday. Some servicemen may have thought of renewal and hope, but the Japanese defenders had a single objective: stop the U.S. advance by any means, regardless of the human cost. Japan's commanders debated how best to hold the island. Some urged an immediate counterstrike the moment the Americans landed. Others counseled patience. Let the invaders come ashore and then grind them down in a war of attrition. A third, more desperate option loomed: massed waves of suicide aircraft and boats, kamikaze attacks. In the end, it was that brutal mixture of attrition and suicidal assaults that American sailors and soldiers would meet in the seas around Okinawa. Kamikaze strikes were not wholly unfamiliar to American forces. Isolated raids began as early as 1943 after Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi devised the tactic as a desperate gambit to cripple U.S. carriers and capital ships in hopes of slowing the American push. Still, nothing the fleet had endured before could match the ferocity of the massive kamikaze onslaught that would descend on the Okinawa task force like a driven cloud of stinging insects. 17-year-old signalman Ward McDonald of Seattle recalled the ship's shakedown off San Pedro, California, in December 1944 with a blend of amusement and unease. One dawn, they steamed down the coast, and during gunnery practice against a towed target, their 5-inch batteries only scored a near miss about a quarter mile from the target. Hardly cause for pride. They ran compass checks, drilled basic seamanship, and spent long stretches mopping up seasick mess from crewmen who hadn't handled the Pacific swells well. McDonald wondered whether they'd be considered fit to join the fighting at all. Somehow, the trials passed, and the transport completed its shakedown. The ship was outfitted with 2 5-inch dual-purpose mounts, one forward and one aft, supplemented by 2 single and 2 twin 40mm anti-aircraft guns and 18 20mm guns to defend the 51 officers and 524 enlisted aboard. It could carry everything needed for an amphibious assault, roughly 1,200 troops and 15 landing craft, and its single General Electric geared drive turbine produced about 8,500 horsepower to push her through the water. In the days after the shakedown, McDonald watched large crates of cold weather gear being hoisted aboard and assumed they were bound for a northern theater, perhaps the Aleutians or Japan's northern shores. When the transport instead headed southwest, he realized the winter clothing had been a ruse, a bit of theater meant to suggest a northern course, while the real destination lay in warmer latitudes. The Goodyu sailed from the west coast on January 4, 1945, with her cargo spaces fully loaded. She reached the Admiralty Islands on January 21st, picked up more supplies and passengers, then pushed on to Hollandia, New Guinea. On February 4th, Captain J.L. Allen took command, and under him the transport became the flagship of Transport Division 51, an honor that also made her the first ship in any column and therefore especially exposed to enemy attack. The transport steamed to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, arriving February 12th with provisions for the bases there, and for the next fortnight the officers and crew took part in rigorous amphibious drills. By late February, they were boarding troops and loading equipment for the Okinawa campaign, practicing additional landing operations, and on March 21st the ship put to sea for the real operation. One more objective remained en route. The small Kerama Islands just south of Okinawa needed to be taken first to serve as a staging area. On March 26th, a powerful American armada that included the Goodyu landed troops to secure that group. Compared with what came later, the Kerama operation was almost routine, but many sailors remembered March 26, 1945, as the day chaos and violence engulfed them. From the sea came suicide motorboats, from the air kamikaze aircraft, and on the beaches were fanatical defenders. There would be no respite for the next 30 days. They endured some 80 air attacks, most of them kamikaze strikes. The reason was clear. The fleet was closing on Japan's main strongholds, and the enemy hurled everything at the approaching Americans. As kamikaze raids grew, the crew of the Goodyu improvised by hauling several Army field guns onto deck to add firepower. The suicide boats, MacDonald later said, seemed to appear from nowhere, and if not watched carefully, slipped beneath a ship's firing arc and detonated, tearing large holes at the waterline. On April 1st, the Goodyu anchored off Kerama Retto while the main landings on Okinawa began. More than 300 vessels lay assembled off the island. Landing craft were lowered and circled as the pre-landing bombardment began at 5:30 a.m., and 64 American planes from nearby carriers struck the island before the first boats hit the beach. By nightfall, a 15,000-yard beachhead had been won and thousands of troops were ashore. At 4:15 p.m. on April 2nd, the Goodyu weighed anchor at Kerama Retto to carry the 307th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Division toward its Okinawa objective. The transport steamed in a three-column formation, the Goodyu leading the right column with Mount Trail, Drew, and Montrose following at 1,200-yard intervals. The columns were separated by 600 yards. The Goodyu kept station with the guide ship Chilton in the center column and Henrico on the left, and as they neared the combat area, the convoy began zigzagging to foil lurking submarines. At about 6:30 that evening, a dozen kamikazes attacked the small armada of transports and their destroyer escorts. The Goodyu's log recorded events precisely. At 6:37 p.m., the after-starboard 20mm and 40mm guns opened on aircraft attacking from abaft the starboard beam. At 6:40, the Henrico was struck in midships. At 6:42, the Telfair was grazed by a suicide plane. 3 planes dove on the Goodyu and her sister ship Talair. Concentrated fire from both vessels destroyed one attacker in midair in a ball of flame. A second slammed into Talair's starboard and port king posts before plunging into the sea, and a third bore down on the Goodyu. Radio Man Second Class. Jack Kennewell later recalled the next moments with painful clarity. After their aft 5-inch gun had downed one Betty bomber, a suicide aircraft came over their bow seconds later and they had no time to react. It struck the crow's nest and inflicted severe damage. Kennewell was cut and bleeding from wounds to his chest, neck, and feet. The Goodyu's log documents the last phase of the attack. At 6:48, an enemy plane was sighted paralleling their course to starboard at about 3,000 yards, then changed to an approach at roughly 1,000 feet altitude. The forward 5-inch gun engaged it at about 1,500 yards. The attacker was identified as a Kawasaki Ki-45 Tory, known to the Allies as Nick, a twin-engine, long-range escort and reconnaissance fighter likely carrying 2 fragmentation bombs under its wings. The combined barrage from the Goodyu and the nearby transport struck the Nick in its port engine and cockpit, setting the aircraft afire. At 6:50 p.m., the suicide plane slammed into the mainmast at the level of the crosstrees. One section of the plane continued over the deck and detonated above the fantail, while the portion containing the cockpit and at least one bomb swung over the port side and exploded at about deck level, most of the wreckage plunging into the sea in flames. MacDonald remembered the scene with terrifying clarity. Stepping onto the main deck, he found himself staring right into the cockpit of a kamikaze coming in on the starboard flank. He watched, eyes wide, as that plane tore through the starboard side of the USS Henrico, blasting a huge hole through the superstructure. Standing only about 10 feet away from a 5-inch gun crew, he saw their faces widen with sheer terror as a vast ball of fire and debris descended. Instinct made him duck to the left. Within moments, the ship's log and the recollections of J.L. and MacDonald would record the cost. 27 killed and 117 wounded. Although the Kamikaze's impact brought down the Goodyu's 30-ton cargo boom, most casualties resulted from bomb fragments and shrapnel showering the deck as the aircraft broke apart overhead. Tulare, Henrico, and Chilton also suffered heavy damage. The destroyer Dickinson took a fatal hit to her bridge that killed 53 sailors, including her captain, and was so crippled she had to be scuttled later. Henrico had been struck by a different suicide aircraft, identified afterward as a twin-engine Betty variant, which crashed into her superstructure and instantly killed the captain, a colonel of the 77th Division, and scores of Navy and Army personnel. Miraculously unhurt, though shaken, MacDonald was taken below for a time. When he returned topside, he found carnage everywhere. The after 5-inch mount was twisted and the gun crew literally vaporized by the blast. No recognizable body parts remained. Screams and moans filled the air, orders rang out, and bodies lay scattered. Peering down from a ladder, he saw a finger with a gold ring lying amid a mass of flesh on the deck. Boatswain's mate, 3rd class, Samuel Kills Brockington. Drafted into the Navy from King Street, South Carolina in March 1944 and assigned to the Goodyu that summer, recalled the man in the crow's nest where the plane struck was wrapped in mangled metal and fragments had driven into the boat. Damage control teams fought desperately to put out several fires before beginning the grim work of gathering the dead and aiding the wounded. Radio Man 3rd Class. Howard G. Hobbs, assigned to that duty, carried memories of that night that would haunt him for life. Motor Machinist's mate 3rd Class, Francis Red Nagel, who piloted one of the landing craft ferrying men and materiel to Okinawa, later described looking up and seeing what seemed like hundreds of kamikaze aircraft filling the sky like an enraged swarm of wasps. The Goodyu's losses were severe, 21 dead and over 100 sailors wounded, roughly a quarter of the ship's company wiped out in minutes. 24 soldiers of the 307th Regiment also became casualties. At least 5 of the 15 transports that had left Kerama Retto that evening were damaged by kamikaze strikes. Across the Okinawa campaign, 27 of the 36 U.S. ships fell victim to suicide planes. 371 U.S. vessels suffered damage, and kamikaze action was estimated to be responsible for 164 of those hits. After the April 2nd attack, the Goodyu withdrew under destroyer escort to the Kerama anchorage for repairs. En route, the dead were given burials on the small island of Zamashima with full military honors, and the wounded were transferred to hospital ships for care. Brockington remembered working through the night on the injured and helping prepare canvas bags for the dead. Among those he bagged was a young Tennessean he had been speaking with the night before the invasion, who had joked about what they would do when we get home. J.L, who had suffered severe wounds when the suicide plane struck the ship, later surveyed the injured aboard a hospital ship and saw men horribly mutilated, some with shrapnel driven into their bodies and others with terrible burns. Cases so grievous many had no chance of recovery, suffering slowly in their bunks. He described some sailors with their eyes burned out and others irrevocably maimed. After several days at anchor, the Goodyu's troops went ashore on Okinawa to rejoin the fight. The USS Goodyu earned 1 battle star for her role in the Okinawa campaign. She was decommissioned on April 5, 1946, sold to the U.S. Maritime Commission in 1947 for commercial use, renamed Hawaiian Citizen, and sailed the Pacific another 34 years, 21 of them as a container ship, before being scrapped in Taiwan in 1982. Though the ship itself is gone, Many veterans who served aboard still survive, gathering annually to remember comrades lost in the previous year. The Goodyu's ordeal was not unique among U.S. Navy ships that faced the ferocious Kamikaze onslaught at Okinawa, but it stands as a representative account of that battle and a grim indication of what an invasion of Japan's home islands might have meant. The vessel and her crew paid dearly in blood and fire, and their story endures as a tribute to the courage and sacrifice of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances in the final chapters of the